Hello and welcome to this podcast. This podcast is going to be about essentially themes of pessimism and antinatalism. Throughout the podcast, we'll explore little themes and vignettes and ideas about topics of philosophical pessimism and the topic of antinatalism, and we'll explore what that really means and how it actually applies to everyday life and why essentially philosophical pessimism has, in my opinion, the true worldview of what's going on in the human condition. So I'd like to just start off with some ideas here about the nature of suffering. And because philosophical pessimism really deals a lot with the negatives of life, but very specifically suffering and what that means. I've pretty much split suffering into what I would consider two categories. One would be the necessary suffering, and one is contingent forms of suffering. Necessary suffering is often considered quote-unquote Eastern, similar to how Buddhism might define it or how you might read about it in books about Buddhist philosophy. That's to say, it's really like an Eastern or Buddhist idea of a general dissatisfaction stemming from a general lack in what is present now. In other words, relief is temporary and unstable, and if life was fully positive without this kind of lack of what is there now, present now, it would be satisfactory and there wouldn't be any needs and wants. This kind of goes back to Schopenhauer's idea. Arthur Schopenhauer, the philosopher of the 19th century, basically in the mid-1800s, 1840s, 1850s. He essentially was advocating the idea that there's this will in existence that is this kind of striving principle, and the will has two sides to it metaphysically. One side is kind of this monistic force, if you will, and the other side is phenomenal, meaning that it is a projection onto a representation of reality that's not as real, quote unquote, as this monistic will flip side. And the side that has this projection and representation, he just calls the world as representation versus the world as will, which is the flip side of that. And the world as representation is this constant dissatisfied animal, we'll say, or being, that is striving and can never quite get the satisfaction or completion or fullness that it's looking for. And so it's kind of like this principle enacted into the world as an object, relating with other objects. And so it gets kind of, more deep into the metaphysics if you read his book, The World as Will and Representation. But basically, it is this Eastern notion of this striving force. So the human and other animals are kind of the striving beings that are manifestations of this greater monistic unified will, which is really only on the flip side. You can kind of only glean at it from what we can understand of ourselves on the side of representation. And it's essentially just this. We are always striving for things that we cannot fully get. We go towards our goals and our desires, and once we get those, we have a temporary form of relief, and then it goes back to being bored again. And so he kind of talks about the human condition is like a pendulum swing between boredom on one side and kind of this goal-seeking and desire fulfillment on the other side. And he calls this suffering because it's this constant burden that we're always kind of, it's like a burden of being itself, where we can never be completely satisfied. He even talks about in his essays, Studies in Pessimism, which are kind of a series of aphorisms and essays. And he even talks about in one of the sections, I believe it's Vanity of Existence, that if human life was fully positive, meaning there wasn't any of this striving in it, then we would be complete and full, and there would be no need for goals. In fact, there would be no need for anything. There would be some sort of tranquil peacefulness of our being that we can never even understand. It's some sort of sublime state. You can maybe call it a nirvana state or enlightened state of some sort. But that is something that humans do not have, or at least most humans don't have. And that is the main state of our existence, is this strivingness that kind of is lacking something, which is usually some sort of satisfaction and needs to be driven by that with our striving. And if we don't have that, we get bored because we still want something, but there's nothing there as a goal, there's nothing in our view, and so it kind of like perseverates on itself and becomes kind of bored. So that's kind of his idea, and also my kind of taking that idea, my idea of what necessary suffering is. He never really used the term necessary in that term for suffering, but that's how I'm splitting this up, is Eastern forms of suffering are considered, in my opinion, necessary, meaning that they are inherent with being born into animal or human existence. There is this kind of need for striving for something, and when we don't get it, there is boredom, and it's just this constant striving that is a dissatisfaction. And so the other form, like I was saying, was contingent suffering, or contingent harms, maybe it might be a better way to put this. So contingent harms are kind of those classic, maybe more Western ideas of what suffering is. It's like the physical harms of sickness and of disasters and of everyday just negative experiences, emotional anguish, annoyances great and small. It could be like the pandemics, things like that, or just the daily grind of a tedious workday. It's the hunger you might feel in your stomach and the pain of a stubbed toe. Essentially, it's any negative external harm that is contingently happening to you because it's contextual in time and place. It's based on kind of in an existential terms the thrownness of your existence, meaning it's kind of based on the fact that your particular situation as a human has certain external elements that you're going to bump into, and it might vary. It will vary in individuals in varying amounts of, so these pains of the everyday life or the big things like disasters, they'll be in varying amounts of intensity and kinds, but it happens to everyone nonetheless. So even though it is contingent, because there are varying amounts of these types of pains and harms, they are still happen to everybody. There's no one who lives a life that is free from these kind of harms. And so, again, they're contingent because they could be different for different people, unlike the inherent or necessary suffering of the Eastern form, which is every human is going to have the same kind of this inherent striving force that is just that pendulum swing. So those are the two kinds of suffering, necessary suffering and contingent suffering. So that being said, what is then philosophical pessimism? Philosophical pessimism deals with the fact that life has a negative value, and thus examines the human condition, understanding these features of these negative values. It is similar in a way if you've ever heard of Gnosticism. Gnosticism was an ancient theology of sorts, a religious idea of sorts. Some would even say it is indeed its own religion that occurred around, we'll say, maybe starting 100 BCE for the Common Era, but really, moving forward and getting momentum after the Christian era, and a lot of times incorporating some of that into the 2, 3, 400s CE, of the Common Era. And essentially, the idea of Gnosticism is that this world is kind of is one of suffering, is one of evil because of this suffering, and the material world is kind of this base quality to it, where we're kind of entrapped souls here that really have a hard time getting out of this situation. And there's a suffering of this physical material world, and there's maybe, the Gnostics had an idea that if you had the wisdom, the gnosis, the knowledge of the true God that's kind of removed from this physical world, then maybe you can kind of overcome it. Now, of course, philosophical pessimism usually doesn't take the form of some sort of religious ideas or things like that, or take the form of some sort of theological, but there are some parallels there. But it's really the idea of that we're, in a way, being born itself is an exile into this existence, right? So that's where there's parallels in a way with Gnosticism. Antinatalism is a lot of times associated with philosophical pessimism. It doesn't necessarily mean it is the exact same thing, or some antinatalists might not even really would consider themselves philosophical pessimists, and some philosophical pessimists might not consider themselves antinatalism, but there's certainly a large overlap. So I would consider antinatalism a ethical response to philosophical pessimism, but it's not the same thing. And similarly, and we'll talk about maybe in future episodes what antinatalism is and all the different kind of maybe varieties and why, what that entails. Philosophical pessimism often does go with people that have pessimistic dispositions, but it also is not the same thing as someone with a pessimistic disposition. So you got to make a distinction between the common usage of the term pessimism and philosophical pessimism. So just like if someone was saying to another person, "Oh, you look really stoic right now," well, that doesn't mean that they're following the philosophy of Zeno, of the Greek philosopher in the 300s BCE, nor is it saying that they're, reading Marcus Aurelius every day, the Roman emperor who claimed to be, a Stoic. It's really just kind of become a common usage for just saying, "Oh yeah, you look like you don't have much emotion right now. You're not showing much emotion." So similarly, when someone pessimism has also been kind of denuded of its original meaning in philosophy, or maybe it might have also had just its parallel meaning anyways going along with it, and most people think it's the common usage, which is, "Oh, you think things are not going to go very well, and or generally depressed, or mild depression of some sort," and it's general, and in other words, someone's general disposition towards life as negative. And that's not necessarily what we mean by philosophical pessimism. And I kind of just explained what it is with the idea of inherent or necessary suffering and contingent suffering, which, by the way, is how I'm framing it. But I mean, that's just kind of putting these ideas together. And like I said, with the Gnosticism type parallels, kind of like atheistic Gnosticism would be a way to say that. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you're a depressed person. In fact, you could be a happy-go-lucky person with a very happy demeanor, and go through life whistling and being very active, having a lot of hobbies, a lot of friends, and still have philosophical pessimistic ideas, meaning that you do believe that even though despite that you might be a happy type personality type or disposition, that you might think that being born is inherently not a good thing, it's negative, and that the world itself has great suffering in it, that maybe inherently there is necessary, like I was saying, necessary suffering in the human condition that you can never get rid of, and that there's a lot of contingent suffering of the situation of being born a certain person at a certain time with certain events happening to you. So again, you could be a happy person with a philosophical pessimistic world view. So that should be separated as well. And again, you can have an optimistic disposition, hold claims of philosophical pessimistic nature, such that there is much suffering inherent in life, And you can generally agree with even philosophers like Arthur Schopenhauer and their works regarding the striving of the human existence and the struggles of the negative experiences of human life. And again, but still be a generally happy person. So just kind of keep that in mind. I think I'm going to stop there with this introduction of what philosophical pessimism is when we're talking about that. We talked about kind of the differences between philosophical pessimism and just the common usage of pessimism, and how we're not using it as the common usage, we're using it as philosophical pessimism in this case. And we'll continue our discussion of that in further episodes. Thank you.